Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. I was knocked out in the back of my F-150 when a sharp rapping on the window yanked me awake around 2 in the morning, and I heard a voice call out. For a few seconds, I just stared into the dark, completely disoriented, trying to remember where the heck I was. Then it hit me again. The Walmart parking lot. Late Tuesday night. Or maybe it had already slipped over into early Wednesday and I'd lost track. When you're living out of your truck, all the days smear together until they feel like one long, blurry stretch of time. The officer said he needed my license and registration while his flashlight beam cut through the fogged-up glass like a spotlight. I could see little clouds of my own breath hanging in the cold Arizona desert air while I fumbled around for my wallet on pure muscle memory. My lower back throbbed from another night on bare metal under a thin sleeping bag and a beat-up moving blanket that barely took the edge off the hardness. This was what my life looked like now at 49 years old. I was Dale Hutchinson, once a guy who owned a solid business, now a man trying to stay ahead of cops and parking citations. I passed my documents through the small crack in the window, assuming this was just one more ticket I had no way to pay. Probably the third slip of paper this week, maybe even the fourth. I honestly wasn't sure anymore. Officer Valdez looked pretty young, mid-30s at most, with soft eyes that almost apologized for dragging me out of whatever passed for sleep. He headed back to his patrol car, and I watched him in the side mirror as he sat down and started typing on the in-car computer. It all looked routine, the same script I'd seen a few times already. I thought we were just running through the standard steps, but then the mood shifted. I watched him lean closer to the screen, squinting like he wasn't sure what he was seeing. He typed something again, paused, waited, then suddenly straightened up like a wire had been pulled tight. Even from about 50 feet away, I could tell his whole energy had changed. He spoke into his radio in this quick, clipped way that made my stomach knot. Then he started walking back toward my truck, but now one hand rested on his holster like he was ready for trouble. "Mr. Hutchinson, I need you to step out of the vehicle slowly," he said, and this time his voice carried a different edge. It sounded careful and on high alert, like every word was being weighed. "Keep your hands where I can see them at all times." My pulse kicked up hard in my chest. I tried to keep my voice steady as I said, "Officer, what's going on here? It's just a parking issue. I can move the truck right now if that's the problem." He answered in that same steady tone. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle, please." His flashlight beam wasn't hitting my face anymore. Now it sat dead center on my chest, following every little move I made like a laser pointer. I eased myself out of the truck, joints stiff from the cold, lifting my hands a bit so he could see them clearly. I asked again what was happening because none of this felt normal anymore. Valdez looked at me with a look I honestly don't think I'll ever forget as long as I live. It was this mix of fear and confusion, like he'd accidentally walked into something way above his rank. He told me that when he ran my license, something unusual had popped up on his screen. He said there was a federal flag tied to my file, dating all the way back to 1987. I repeated the year out loud, stunned, and realized that was 37 years ago. I would have been 17 back then, just a kid trying to figure out life. He turned his patrol car screen toward me so I could see for myself. Right there, in angry red letters that practically shouted, was a notice that made my stomach drop. It said there was a federal flag and that Homeland Security had to be notified. It labeled me as a subject of interest. Under that was a file date listed as August 15th, 1987. He went on to say Homeland Security wanted my exact location documented and that they already had people on the way to meet us. "Sir," he said, "I need you to sit down on the curb and stay put without moving around." My hands started shaking while I stared at that screen like it might change if I looked long enough. Then the date finally rang a bell in the back of my mind. August 15th, 1987. The day my Uncle Roy died in that car crash. The same uncle who'd left me his old Chevy pickup in his will. That was the truck I used to launch my little landscaping company, the one that used to make me proud. But Uncle Roy had always been cagey about what he actually did for a living, brushing off questions with goofy jokes about boring government office work. Sitting there on that freezing curb, watching Officer Valdez pace back and forth while we waited for whoever was coming, one thought just kept looping in my head. What on earth had Uncle Roy gotten tangled up in back then? And even more unsettling, why had my ex-associate, Gordon Puit, looked so strangely pleased years ago when he found out I was related to Roy during that family dinner? I remembered Gordon leaning toward his son Travis and muttering, almost under his breath, "Roy Hutchinson's nephew," like that suddenly made everything make sense to him. Then he added quietly, "That explains a lot." About 20 minutes later, a black Suburban with government plates rolled slowly into the far end of the parking lot. There were no flashing lights or blaring sirens, just a quiet black SUV rolling in and stopping like it was there on serious business. A woman stepped out, introduced later as Agent Deborah Concincaid, and the glint from her badge caught the streetlight as she walked toward me with purpose. She looked completely professional in a dark suit that didn't care what time it was, even though it was 2 a.m. in a Walmart parking lot. "Dale Hutchinson?" she asked, even though I could tell from her tone she already knew exactly who I was. She followed it up by confirming I was the son of Leonard Hutchinson and the nephew of Roy Hutchinson, like she was checking boxes on a list. I answered yes, ma'am, because what else was I going to say? She studied me for a second, taking in the middle-aged guy in wrinkled clothes who'd been sleeping in the bed of his truck, and I saw her expression soften just a little around the edges. "Mr. Hutchinson," she said, "we've been trying to track you down for a very long time. She told me my uncle had left something behind before he died, something tied to national security, and she believed the fact I was sleeping in my truck instead of resting in my own home was directly connected to what he uncovered almost 4 decades ago. She took out a tablet, swiped through a few screens like she'd done it 100 times, and then held it so I could see the image on it. It was a photo of my Uncle Roy in a military uniform, standing next to a few men I didn't recognize at all. In the background, almost hidden, but definitely there if you knew to look, was a much younger version of Gordon Puit. She told me my former father-in-law wasn't just some retired banker enjoying golf and grandkids. Then she dropped the real bomb and said my uncle hadn't died in a simple car accident like we'd all been told. She explained that the flag on my record was put there as a kind of shield, meant to warn them if anyone ever tried to wreck my life the same way his had been wrecked. She added that it looked like that protection had shown up about 37 years later than planned, but at least it had finally kicked in. I felt the cold sink into my bones, and it wasn't from the desert night or the metal curb under me. All at once, things started snapping into place in my head. Gordon's instant dislike when he learned who my uncle was, the way he slowly tore my business apart, and how determined he'd been to separate me from his daughter suddenly took on a new color. It wasn't just about social class or image. He hadn't been guarding some fancy family reputation. He'd been guarding a secret my uncle had apparently died trying to bring into the light. "Mr. Hutchinson," Agent Concincaid said as she offered me her hand and helped me stand up, "we need to have a serious conversation about what really happened in 1987 and why Gordon Puit has spent the last year making sure you lost everything and everyone you could lean on." She said he believed that if he drove me all the way down to rock bottom, if he stripped me of support and stability, I'd never manage to uncover what my uncle had left behind. Then she said simply that he had miscalculated. 6 months earlier, I'd have told you I was living the American dream, or at least my version of it. My company, Green Valley Landscapes, had 12 full-time employees and maintenance contracts with about half the commercial properties around Tucson. I'd built that business from the ground up, starting with nothing more than a beat-up push mower and that old Chevy truck my uncle left me when I was 29. 20 years of 16-hour days, sweating through blistering 100-degree summers and freezing desert mornings, had finally turned into something solid and respectable. Around town, I had a reputation as the landscaper who always showed up when he said he would and delivered quality work every single time, no excuses. Renata and I had been married for 24 years, and we'd raised 2 great kids in a 4-bedroom house up in the Catalina foothills, the kind of place with white stucco walls and a red tile roof that practically advertised comfortable middle-class Arizona family to anyone driving by. Our son Austin was 22, wrapping up his business degree at Arizona State, and our daughter Brianna was 19 and halfway through her 2nd year of nursing school. They were good kids, smart, driven, and responsible. Basically everything a dad hopes for when he thinks about his children's future. But from the very beginning, there'd always been a strain with Renata's parents. On day 1, Gordon Puit let me know I wasn't the kind of man he'd pictured for his only daughter. A landscaper, he'd said the first time Renata brought me to their country club, like the word itself was a warning label. When he shook my hand, he glanced at my calloused fingers, and I could practically see him running the math in his head and deciding I came up short. Gordon was old Scottsdale money, the kind of man who wore golf shirts that probably cost more than my guys made in a day out in the sun. And he carried himself like the world was neatly divided between people who managed wealth and people who mowed the lawns outside their offices. He'd been a senior vice president at Desert Financial Bank for close to 30 years, shifting other people's money around like chess pieces on a board, while men like me moved dirt, planted trees, and watched our backs in 110-degree heat. His wife, Marlene, was her own special kind of difficult, always smiling with that polished, practiced grace while slipping in little comments that reminded Renata of what she could have had if she'd chosen differently. Dr. Brennan's son just bought a house in Paradise Valley, Marlene would say at family dinners, her voice light and pleasant as she passed the asparagus with restaurant-level presentation. 8,000 square feet, can you imagine? His cardiology practice is doing so well. Remember when he took you to prom, Renata? She'd tilt her head and laugh like it was a sweet memory, but the point was always the same. You traded up for less. Over the years, I learned to let the noise wash over me, cutting my steak or spooning potatoes while Gordon settled into his weekly lecture on investment portfolios, market cycles, and how real wealth is built. Travis, Renata's younger brother, would sit across the table with that smug little smirk, clearly entertained. He'd inherited Gordon's arrogance, along with the real estate development company Gordon handed him like a graduation gift. Another empire dropped into his lap without a single blister or one drop of sweat on his forehead. Dad built something from nothing. My son Austin would jump in, his voice edged with that fierce loyalty he'd earned working on my crews every summer since he was big enough to push a mower. He employs 12 people. He's a job creator. Gordon would just swirl his wine, not even looking at me, and say, "Anyone can cut grass, Austin. It takes vision to build real wealth. Your father works in his business, not on it. There's a ceiling to how far manual labor can take a man." It was like he'd memorized the line from some leadership book and decided to use me as the cautionary example. But I had my own quiet pride that he never understood. Every commercial property I took care of, every perfectly edged lawn and crisp hedge line, every healthy tree that made a parking lot feel less like a furnace, all of it represented something I had earned with my own two hands. No inheritance, no special introductions at the country club, no old boys network returning favors. Just Dale Hutchinson and his willingness to show up earlier, stay later, and handle the jobs other crews turned down. For a long time, Renata stood up for me too. In those early years, when we still felt like it was us against the world, she'd look her father straight in the eye and say, "Dale's a good man, Daddy. He takes care of his family. Isn't that what matters?" Gordon would lean back, his gray eyes cold and flat like a winter sky, and say, "There's taking care of a family, and then there's providing the life they deserve. You could have had so much more, sweetheart." The thing that always confused me was that, from where I was standing, our life was more than enough. We drove to San Diego every summer, stayed in modest beach hotels, and spent long days building sandcastles and letting the kids chase waves. We had 2 reliable cars in the garage, nothing flashy but paid for, and we never sat at the kitchen table wondering how we'd cover the mortgage or keep the lights on. I coached Austin's little league team for 10 straight years, dragging coolers of sports drinks to dusty fields, and I never missed one of Brianna's dance recitals, no matter how exhausted I was from a full day's work. We had friends who'd come over for barbecues on weekends, filling the backyard with smoke, laughter, and the squeak of the screen door as kids ran in and out. We had date nights at local restaurants where the owners knew our names and asked about the kids. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, a solid life built out of sweat, reliability, and love. Still, Gordon kept planting little seeds of doubt in Renata's mind, watering them with snide comments and pointed comparisons about what she was supposedly missing by tying her life to a man who drove a work truck instead of a luxury sedan. Every holiday or birthday gathering slowly turned into a quiet exercise in humiliation. He'd introduce me to his golf buddies with a polite smile and say, "This is Renata's husband. He does lawn work," in the same tone someone might use to mention a distant cousin who'd had some trouble getting his life together. Marlene would make sure I was seated at the far end of the table, away from the main conversation, like I belonged in the outer orbit instead of the center of their family universe. Looking back now, I can see how those small cuts added up, how they wore down the foundation of our marriage, but at the time, I just kept my head down and worked. The last normal day of my life came on a Thursday in March, and it didn't feel special at first. I just landed a contract to maintain the landscaping for a brand new medical complex, the biggest deal my company had ever secured. The kind of account that made all those early mornings and late nights feel worth it. I pulled into the driveway that Thursday evening with a bottle of champagne on the passenger seat, already picturing Renata's surprised smile when I told her about the medical complex contract and how this deal was going to change everything for our family. But the second I walked through the door, the air in the house felt off, too quiet, too controlled. I stepped into the kitchen and saw Renata sitting at the table with her parents, stacks of papers spread out like we were in some kind of boardroom instead of our home, and Gordon looked up at me with a look I'd never seen in his eyes before. Not just disapproval, but something like triumph. "Victory, Dale," Renata said, her voice stiff and formal, like she was reading from a prepared script. "We need to talk about our future." That word, future, landed in my chest like a stone, because it didn't sound like she was inviting me into it. When I look back, I can see that everything really started coming apart the day Gordon retired from his job as senior vice president at Desert Financial Bank. We'd all treated it like a big milestone, his golden years finally starting after 4 decades of moving money through the desert economy, but stepping away from the bank gave him something dangerous: unlimited time and a new purpose, which he decided was fixing what he saw as the mistakes in his daughter's life. He began showing up at Renata's real estate office every morning, carrying her favorite coffee and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, mixing caffeine with criticism like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're 47 years old, living beneath your potential," he'd tell her while scrolling through her listings on her computer screen. "Look at these properties you're showing. Starter homes and rental units. You should be selling estates in Paradise Valley, not 3 bedrooms in Tempe." At first, I didn't see it as sabotage, just more of Gordon being Gordon, but the shift came faster than I expected. The first real hit landed when Travis called me into his sleek downtown Phoenix office, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the view that screamed success. He owned 7 strip malls across the valley, and Green Valley Landscapes maintained all of them. Those properties made up about 30% of my annual revenue, the steady, dependable money that kept the lights on during slow seasons. "Dale, nothing personal," he said, avoiding my eyes as he slid a termination notice across his glass desk like it was just another document. "Found a company that can do it for 20% less. You understand? It's just business. 20% less." I could feel heat rising in my face as I stood up, already knowing in my gut what this was really about. "Travis, we've worked together for 8 years, I reminded him. "My guys know every sprinkler head on your properties, every timer, every drainage issue. We've saved you thousands fixing other people's mistakes." "Decisions made," he said, already glancing down at his phone like the conversation was over. "They start Monday." In one silent handshake and a short walk to the elevator, I lost $300,000 in annual contracts. But that was just Gordon's opening move. His banking connections ran deep, and within 2 weeks, my business line of credit, the financial backbone that kept cash flowing between invoices, was suddenly flagged and frozen for routine review. Desert Financial had been my lender for 15 years, through recessions, droughts, and equipment breakdowns. I'd never missed a single payment. My account history was spotless. "I don't understand," I told the branch manager, sitting in his office with my stomach in knots. "I've got payroll due Friday. I've never been late. What's going on?" "These reviews are standard procedure, Mr. Hutchinson," he said, folding his hands like he'd rehearsed the line. "Should be resolved in 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks. I had 12 employees counting on those checks, 12 families with rent, groceries, and medical bills. I drained my personal savings to cover the next 2 payrolls, every dollar I'd put aside for emergencies and college, and maybe one day, a small cabin by a lake. I maxed out credit cards to cover the third, telling myself it was temporary, that the bank would clear everything once they realized there was no issue. But by week 4, nothing had changed, and I had to start making the calls I'd prayed I'd never have to make. "Miguel, I'm so sorry," I told my foreman, the guy who'd been with me for 8 years, through broken equipment and record heat and every headache that came with this business. "As soon as this banking mess gets sorted, you're my first call, I promise." "It's not your fault, boss," he said quietly, but I could see the worry in his eyes, the calculations he was making about his 3 kids and his mortgage, and how long his savings would last. While I was busy fighting fires on the business side, Gordon was steadily working on Renata with the patience of a surgeon. He'd show up with glossy brochures for multi-million-dollar homes, sliding them across the table and casually dropping names. He'd talk about how her friend Jennifer had just married a commercial developer and now spent her days staging luxury properties. "Remember Nathan Walcott from the country club?" he'd say. "His construction company just landed the airport expansion contract. He asked about you the other day, you know. Recently divorced." I watched as Renata started coming home later and later, brushing off family dinners with vague explanations about showings and client meetings. She began skipping meals, spending more time on her phone, and avoiding eye contact when I asked simple questions about her day. Her wedding ring disappeared first on weekends, then on weekdays, and when I finally asked why, she shrugged and said it interfered with her typing. One night, when I gently pushed harder, and telling her it hurt to see her without it, her whole demeanor shifted. She pulled back emotionally like a door closing. "Maybe Daddy's right," she said, her voice flat, almost distant. "I've been thinking about this for years, Dale." And in that moment, I realized Gordon hadn't just been criticizing me. He'd been slowly rewriting the story of our entire marriage in her mind. "You're a good man, but you'll never be good enough for this family. Look at our friends. Look at their lives. We're stuck in the same place we were 10 years ago." When she said that, it felt like the floor quietly dropped out from under me. Stuck? I thought about the long days and late nights, the early mornings loading equipment, the school events, the holidays. Stuck? We're raising 2 great kids, we own our home, we take vacations. What more do you want? I asked, honestly confused, because from where I stood, we'd climbed a long way from nothing. More, she said simply, not raising her voice, not breaking eye contact. I want more. It wasn't a tantrum or a bad day talking, it was a decision already made. 2 weeks later, the divorce papers showed up like they'd been waiting in a drawer for someone to pick the right moment. The prenup Gordon had pushed for before our wedding turned out to be airtight. Every clause and condition tightened for his side. Back then, he'd paid for the lawyer, smiled, and told me it was just smart business to protect both of us, that it was standard for families with certain assets. Standing in that attorney's office 24 years later, I realized it had always been a trap, carefully set and patiently waiting for the right time to spring shut. With my business revenue collapsing and my line of credit frozen, I couldn't afford a strong attorney of my own. I ended up with the cheapest representation I could find, a guy who kept glancing at the clock during our meetings. Renata got the house, both cars, and primary custody of the kids. I got 72 hours to move out of the home I'd spent 2 decades paying for and supervised visitation rights that Gordon's attorney friend crafted with restrictions so tight they felt like punishment. The visits had to be in public places, scheduled in advance and never outside a narrow window. "Dad, why can't you just come home?" Brianna asked me during one of our coffee shop visits, her hands wrapped around a paper cup, eyes darting between me and the parking lot window where Renata waited in the car. I forced a smile I didn't feel and said, "It's complicated, sweetheart. Your mom and I just need some space to figure things out." I couldn't bring myself to tell her that this wasn't about space. It was about control, about making sure I stayed on the outside looking in. But Gordon wasn't finished tightening the screws. He leaned on every commercial property owner in his network, making sure the story going around was that Green Valley Landscapes was unstable, behind on obligations, and not to be trusted with large contracts. One by one, my remaining accounts disappeared. Some sent polite emails, others didn't bother with explanations at all. Within 4 months, I went from being seen as a successful small business owner to a man sleeping in the back of his truck, showering at the YMCA, rotating between parking lots to keep from getting tickets or having cops knock on my window every night. The final humiliation came the day I saw Gordon outside his country club, standing there in his pressed polo and spotless golf shoes, surrounded by manicured greens I would have been proud to maintain. I walked up to him, my clothes worn from work and stress, and said, you did this. You destroyed my life." He didn't bother pretending otherwise. He didn't even look surprised. "I told you 24 years ago you'd never be good enough for my daughter," he said calmly. "Some men are meant to rise, Dale. Others are meant to maintain their lawns. You should have stayed in your place." "My place?" I repeated, feeling anger rise in my chest. "I built a business. I raised a family." He adjusted his golf glove like he was getting ready to tee off and said, "You played in dirt, and now you're back where you belong, in the gutter." That sentence echoed in my mind later that night as I sat alone in the Walmart parking lot, the same place where Officer Valdez would eventually tap on my window. When he ran my license, I figured the worst he'd find would be a stack of unpaid parking tickets, maybe enough to haul me in for fines I couldn't cover. At that point, honestly, I was worn down enough that spending a few nights in a cell didn't sound much worse than another week trying to survive in my truck. 3 weeks earlier, I'd sat in that same truck with my father's old revolver resting across my lap, staring at it and wondering if everyone would be better off without me dragging them down. The darkness pressed in, and for a moment, the idea of ending the struggle felt like relief. The only thing that stopped me was picturing Austin and Brianna hearing that their dad had given up on them, that I'd walked away from the fight when they still needed me. That thought was heavier than the gun, so I put it back in the glove box and told myself I'd keep going one more day, then another. When Valdez mentioned a federal flag from 1987, it cut through the fog in my brain like a key scraping inside a lock that hadn't been turned in years. 1987? I asked, my mind suddenly racing backward instead of forward, flipping through old memories like pages in a worn-out book. "Officer, I was 17 in 1987. I've never even had a speeding ticket before this year." Valdez frowned slightly and looked back at his computer screen, scrolling through information I couldn't see from where I sat. "Sir, this flag is connected to a Roy Hutchinson," he said. "Relation?" "My Uncle Roy," I answered, feeling the name hit me like a splash of ice water. He'd died in August 1987, leaving me his battered Chevy truck, the same truck I later used to start Green Valley Landscapes. Uncle Roy had always been vague about his work, brushing off questions with lines about serving his country in ways most folks wouldn't understand. He was my uncle, I said slowly, feeling pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known existed start to edge together. He died in a car accident that year. Single vehicle, hit a tree on a straight road. Even as I spoke the words, they suddenly didn't sound as simple as they once had. "Mr. Hutchinson, I need to make a call," Valdez said quietly, taking a few steps away from my truck, but never fully turning his back, keeping me in his line of sight like I might suddenly grow fangs or wings. I watched him lift his phone, his posture stiff, and start talking fast into the receiver, his free hand moving as he tried to explain something that clearly wasn't routine. Every now and then he glanced over at me, like he was checking to make sure I was still sitting where he'd left me on that cold curb. Those 20 minutes felt like an hour, the desert air cutting through my thin jacket while my mind ran circles around every mistake I'd ever made, trying to figure out which one had triggered all this. Then the black Suburban rolled into the lot, no sirens, no lights, just this quiet, heavy presence that said whatever was happening had gone way above a simple parking violation. The woman who stepped out introduced herself as Agent Deborah Concincaid, and she was nothing like the federal agents you see in movies with dramatic lines and quick tempers. She moved with calm, steady purpose, like someone who'd done this 1,000 times and didn't need to prove anything to anyone. "Dale Hutchinson," she said, her voice level but not unkind. "I'm Agent Concincaid with Homeland Security. We've been looking for Roy Hutchinson's next of kin for 37 years. Hearing my uncle's name out of her mouth in that setting sent a strange chill through me. She pulled a tablet from her bag, tapped in a series of passwords, and navigated through what looked like secured screens filled with government logos and warning labels. "Your uncle wasn't just military intelligence, Mr. Hutchinson," she continued. "He was part of a classified operation that uncovered a major Soviet spy ring operating through American financial institutions in the 1980s. I blinked, trying to connect the dots between my uncle who used to slip me $20 bills on birthdays and the words Soviet spy ring. "Soviet spies in Arizona?" I asked, because that was the only piece my brain could grab onto. "Not just Arizona," she said, shaking her head. "Nationwide. They were using banks to launder money and steal financial intelligence. Your uncle identified the network and documented everything. He was 2 days away from testifying to a federal grand jury when he died in that accident." She handed me the tablet, and my hands shook a little as I took it. On the screen were declassified documents, whole sections blacked out with heavy redactions, but enough left visible to tell a story. I saw grainy photos of bank executives meeting with men flagged as known Soviet operatives, financial records showing strange transfers and shell accounts, and then my eyes landed on a list of suspected but never fully proven collaborators. One name jumped off the screen like it had been highlighted just for me. Garrett Puit, Gordon's father. For a moment, everything around me went quiet. "Your uncle died before he could testify," Agent Concincaid explained, her voice softer now. "But he was smart. He knew they might come for him, so he hid evidence somewhere. The flag on your file was created to alert us if any of his family ever showed up in the system under unusual circumstances, especially if they were in distress. The theory was that if the network was still active, they might try to neutralize any potential threats that remained." "You think Gordon knew about this?" I asked, but honestly, the answer was already forming in the back of my mind like a storm cloud. "Mr. Hutchinson, when did Gordon Puit first learn you were Roy Hutchinson's nephew?" she asked. I dug back through my memories, flipping through years of holidays and dinners until one moment snapped into focus. It was a dinner party about 5 years into our marriage. Gordon's father, Garrett, was still alive then, in his 80s, frail but sharp. We were at their house, and Renata casually mentioned that my uncle had left me my first truck when he passed. Garrett had gone pale, the color draining from his face. "Roy Hutchinson from Fort Wooka?" he'd asked, his voice suddenly tight. When I nodded and confirmed it, he'd leaned over and whispered something quickly to Gordon, too low for me to catch. From that moment on, Gordon had looked at me differently, like I'd changed from a minor annoyance into a potential problem. "About 19 years ago," I told Agent Concincaid. "His father was still alive. They both acted strange when they found out." Agent Concincaid nodded, like this lined up with something she already suspected. "We believe Gordon has spent years quietly trying to figure out what you might know or what Roy might have left you," she said. "When he couldn't find anything, he changed tactics. If he couldn't access the information through you, he decided to destroy you instead. Make sure you'd never be in a position to discover anything or act on it." I shook my head slowly. "But I don't know anything," I said. "Uncle Roy never told me about any of this. Not once." She held my gaze. "That's what we need to find out." Your uncle was brilliant at hiding things in plain sight, she said. He left you his truck for a reason. But there's something else. Something he hid that we've never been able to locate. And for the first time in months, I felt something other than shame and exhaustion. I felt the faint, uneasy sense that my life had been part of a much bigger story I never knew I was in. Agent Concincaid studied me for a moment and then said quietly that their working theory was simple and ugly. Gordon's recent escalation, the systematic dismantling of every part of my life, meant he believed I was getting close to something, even if I didn't realize it myself, like a man circling a buried landmine without seeing it. She stood up from the curb, brushed off her slacks, and offered me her hand to help me to my feet. "Mr. Hutchinson, we need your help," she said, her tone steady but urgent. "Help us find what your uncle hid, and we'll help you get your life back. More importantly, we'll finally expose what Gordon Puit and his family have been hiding for 40 years. For the first time in 6 months, I felt something besides the heavy mix of shame and exhaustion that had been living in my chest. It was like a small flame of purpose flickered on, mixed with this strange realization that my uncle had been trying to protect me all along, even from beyond the grave, leaving tripwires and warnings in systems I didn't know existed. The next morning, after a restless few hours of sleep at a small motel they arranged, Agent Concincaid and I drove up to my father's house in Phoenix. Dad still lived in the same low, ranch-style place where I'd grown up, the kind of single-story home with gravel front landscaping and a big shade tree out back. At 74, he kept it spotless, every bush trimmed, every tool hanging in its place in the garage like he was still expecting an inspection. He'd stored Uncle Roy's belongings in that garage for decades, boxes stacked neatly on metal shelving units, labeled only with dates and vague descriptions. I'd walked past them 100 times over the years and never thought to open them. Roy was paranoid those last few months, Dad said as he pulled a dusty box from the top shelf, his voice softer than usual. Kept saying someone was following him, tapping his phone. I figured it was stress from his government work. I didn't know what to do with his stuff, so I just kept it. We spent the next 3 hours going through everything, working our way through the past one cardboard box at a time. There were pressed military uniforms with faded name patches, old black and white photographs of bases and fellow soldiers, and bundles of letters from his army days tied with brittle string. It felt like stepping into a version of my uncle's life I'd never known, one built out of discipline and secrets. Then Agent Concincaid opened a battered green army locker shoved against the back wall. She knelt down and ran her fingers along the inside, frowning slightly. "This doesn't look right," she murmured. "The bottom seems too shallow compared to the outside depth." She traced the interior edges carefully, then pressed one corner with her thumb. There was a soft click, and a narrow panel popped up, revealing a hidden compartment underneath. My heart thumped harder as she lifted it. Inside the compartment were several thin, clear microfiche slides, the old transparent sheets libraries used to keep newspapers and records, along with a small leather-bound journal wrapped carefully in plastic to protect it from dust and moisture. Agent Concincaid picked up one of the slides and held it up toward the overhead garage light. Even from a few steps away, I could see tiny columns and lines that looked like bank documents. "This is it," she breathed, and for the first time I heard real emotion break through her professional calm. "Your uncle documented everything. Financial transfers, meeting notes, photographs, all of it." She hurried out to her vehicle and came back with a portable microfiche reader, the kind that folds up into a small case. We carried everything inside and set it up on the kitchen table where I'd eaten cereal as a kid. Dad sat at the end of the table, arms crossed, eyes locked on the screen. We huddled around the device while she slid in the first sheet. The documents that appeared on the illuminated screen were worse than anything I'd imagined. Line after line of transactions showed money moving through Desert Financial Bank and other institutions, some with legitimate-sounding business names that Agent Concincaid said were shells. It was right there in black and white. Garrett Puit hadn't just been a suspected collaborator. He'd been a key player, using his senior position at Desert Financial to route Soviet money through respectable American businesses. The amounts were staggering, millions of dollars moving through accounts over years, funding intelligence and influence operations across the Southwest. Then she loaded another slide and pulled up a series of photographs from 1986 that made everything snap into focus. One photo showed a young Gordon Puit, maybe 30 years old, in a suit and tie, shaking hands with a man Agent Concincaid identified as Dmitry Vulov, a known Soviet intelligence officer whose face was in their databases. In the background, slightly out of focus but unmistakable, stood Garrett Puit, watching the handshake with what looked a lot like approval. Another image from a banking conference in Mexico City showed Gordon in a hotel lobby exchanging briefcases with the same man, both of them glancing around like they knew they weren't supposed to be seen together. Gordon wasn't just protecting his father's reputation, Agent Concincaid explained, her voice tight. He was an active participant. When his father retired, Gordon took over the network, updating it for the post-Soviet era. They shifted from old-school espionage to sophisticated money laundering for Russian oligarchs and other foreign interests. Then we opened the leather journal. Inside were pages and pages of my uncle's cramped handwriting, detailed notes about meetings, phone calls, travel, and the Puit family's movements. He'd written down names, dates, bank branches, even license plates. One entry from July 1987 stood out because it felt like he was talking directly to us across time. "They know I'm on to them," it read. "Garrett Puit called my commanding officer trying to get me transferred. I've made copies of everything. If something happens to me, my nephew Dale will inherit more than just my truck." I stared at those words, my name written in ink older than some of my employees had been, and finally understood that my life hadn't just randomly fallen apart. I was caught in the tail end of a story that had started long before I was old enough to understand the rules. The truth has a stubborn way of surfacing, even if it has to claw its way up through 4 decades of secrets. And once Agent Concincaid saw those documents and my uncle's notes, she shifted into a different gear. "We need to move fast," she said, already dialing her phone, pacing my dad's kitchen like it had turned into a command center. "If Gordon destroyed your life this systematically, he's not acting out of pride alone. It means he's still protecting active operations." Within 4 hours, while the sun was barely clearing the rooftops, federal agents had emergency warrants in hand for Gordon's houses, his offices, and his bank records. I sat in the passenger seat of Agent Concincaid's vehicle parked across from his Scottsdale mansion, watching as black SUVs rolled up and agents in jackets marked with big white letters moved in with quiet precision. They went through the front door and the side gates, and a few minutes later, Gordon was led out in handcuffs, his perfect hair slightly out of place, his face twisted into a mix of shock and rage I'd never seen on him before. When his eyes locked onto me sitting in the car, his expression hardened into pure hatred. "You knew," he shouted as they guided him toward the federal vehicle. "You've always known?" His voice cracked with fury. "No, Gordon," I called back through the open window, my voice shaking but steady enough. "I didn't know anything. You destroyed my life because of your paranoia. You created your own downfall." After that, everything moved at a pace I could barely process. The investigation didn't just stop at Gordon, it exploded outward like a series of dominoes. Travis's shiny real estate empire turned out to be built on laundered money, with shell companies and phony investments popping up in file after file. Desert Financial Bank's executive board was exposed as compromised, some through direct involvement, others through willful blindness. 40 years of hidden financial crimes began to unravel in a matter of weeks as agents followed the trail my uncle had mapped out so many years ago. The federal government eventually traced over $300 million in hidden accounts and investments, along with properties purchased using illegal funds, all tied into a network stretching from Phoenix to Moscow and back again. As we sat there watching FBI teams carry box after box out of Gordon's house, my phone rang. It was Austin. "Dad, what's happening?" he asked, his voice tight. "Mom's hysterical. Federal agents are at Grandpa's house. The news is saying something about Russian money laundering. They're saying you're involved somehow." I took a breath, trying to steady my thoughts. "I'm not involved the way they think, son," I said. "Your grandfather has been hiding something terrible for 40 years. He destroyed our family to protect his crimes." "Mom wants to talk to you," Austin said, and I heard muffled voices as he handed over the phone. Then I heard Renata's voice, raw and shaky. "Dale, I didn't know," she said, words tumbling out. "I swear I didn't know. My father told me you were holding me back, that you were beneath us. But it was all lies, wasn't it? He was never afraid of your work or your status. He was terrified of you." "Not of me, Renata," I said gently. "Of the truth my uncle left behind." She started to cry then, not the controlled tears she used to shed during arguments, but deep, shaking sobs like the ones I'd heard only once before when her mother was diagnosed with cancer. "I threw away our marriage for a lie," she said. "I let him poison me against you. Dale, our whole life was real, and I destroyed it for his approval." As I listened, Agent Concincaid tapped my shoulder and turned her tablet toward me. A notification showed that the government had just frozen over $50 million in Puit family assets. In a single day, my father-in-law's empire, built on blood, fear, and betrayal, had crumbled. Months later, the legal outcomes came down one by one. Gordon Puit was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for financial crimes that stretched back 4 decades, and the judge called it one of the most extensive money laundering operations ever uncovered in Arizona. Travis received 5 years and lost his real estate licenses in 7 states. His self-made success revealed as a house built on stolen funds. Marlene, who was cleared of direct criminal involvement but crushed by the public shame, moved to Maine to live with her sister and never spoke to me again, not even to offer an apology or a goodbye. Desert Financial Bank faced heavy federal oversight and paid $90 million in fines for institutional failures and willful blindness. 23 executives were indicted, some in courtrooms I watched on TV from my dad's living room. The scandal made national news for weeks, with reporters dubbing it the Puit Network and drawing graphics that linked Arizona desert suburbs to Russian oligarchs who had quietly used the American Southwest as their personal washing machine for dirty money. The government's witness protection program offered me something I never expected, a substantial reward tied to the recovered documents. $2 million outright, plus another $1 million pulled from the seized assets as restitution for the deliberate destruction of my business and the years of income I'd lost. When they first told me the amount, I just sat there, numb, because for so long I'd been counting every dollar at gas stations and living off cheap coffee. It wasn't really about the money, though I'd be lying if I said it didn't help. It was about vindication, about finally knowing I hadn't imagined the slow, steady campaign Gordon had waged against me. Every person who'd watched him belittle me at those country club dinners, every smug look when he'd introduced me as the guy who cuts grass, now had to live with the truth. The man who'd called me dirt under his fingernails was heading to federal prison in shackles, his image shattered on national news. I used the reward money to rebuild Green Valley landscapes from the ground up, but this time I did it differently. I sat down with Miguel and the guys who'd stood by me through the worst years and offered them more than just their old jobs back. I gave them equity stakes in the company, real ownership, so the wins and losses would belong to all of us. Miguel cried when he signed the paperwork, said no one had ever trusted him that way before. We invested in better equipment, smarter scheduling software, and a real office instead of doing everything out of my truck and kitchen table. Within a year, we were bigger than before. With commercial contracts, Gordon's influence could no longer touch or sabotage. The medical complex that had canceled our contract during his quiet war against me called one afternoon, the director's voice sheepish as he asked if we'd consider coming back. I listened, let him explain how they'd been burned by the cheaper company, then calmly told him we'd return at double the original rate, with a long-term agreement and clear terms. He agreed without hesitation. 6 months after Gordon's sentencing, Brianna sat across from me at a small Italian restaurant, twirling pasta around her fork, and said, "Dad, you were never not good enough. They were the ones not good enough for you. Grandpa was a criminal hiding behind his money." Hearing that from her meant more than any court ruling. Austin, who had watched everything unfold with a mix of anger and disbelief, changed his major from business to criminal justice, inspired by Agent Concincaid and the team that had taken down the network. "I want to catch the Gordon Puits of the world, Dad," he told me. "The ones who think they're untouchable because they wear expensive suits and belong to the right clubs." Ranata and I didn't get back together. There was just too much damage, too many words we couldn't take back, and too much trust that had been chipped away long before the divorce papers were filed. But we learned how to be civil, even kind, for the sake of our kids. During one of our final conversations about the marriage, she admitted what I'd suspected deep down. "He'd been feeding me lies for years," she said quietly. Little comments, little comparisons. It was like arsenic in small doses. "He made me believe I deserved better, that I was wasting my potential with you. He convinced me that your so-called lack of ambition was holding me back." She wiped her eyes and added, "But Dale, what I had with you was already better than anything his world could offer. I traded real love for fool's gold." After everything came out, she sold the big house in the foothills and moved into a modest apartment in Tempe. Without her father's connections and pressure, she rebuilt her real estate career from scratch, this time focusing on helping young families find their first homes instead of chasing luxury listings to impress people at dinner parties. The last I heard, she was doing well, working hard, and living a quieter, more honest life. Officer Ramon Valdez and I ended up becoming unlikely friends. We meet for a beer once a month at a sports bar downtown, watching games on big screens and talking about work, kids, and the strange turns life can take. "You know, Mr. Hutchinson," he said one evening, tapping his bottle against the table, "that night I pulled you over, I almost didn't run your license. Something in my gut told me to check. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was something else." I smiled and told him that something else might have been Uncle Roy watching over both of us. I'll never know for sure, but I like to think my uncle was waiting all those years for the right moment, for justice to finally come knocking on the right door. He died protecting America from enemies hidden in plain sight, men who used banks and boardrooms instead of guns. And 37 years later, his nephew, the landscaper he trusted, helped finish the job he started. I still drive trucks, still work with my hands, still come home covered in honest dirt at the end of the day. But now I carry a different kind of understanding with me. Gordon Puit didn't try to destroy me because I wasn't good enough. He tried to destroy me because deep down he feared I might be exactly good enough to expose what his family really was. The man he mocked for playing in dirt had been sitting on buried treasure the whole time, the kind of evidence that can bring down kingdoms built on lies. My story isn't really about revenge or even about punishment. It's about how truth can wait longer than any lie, how it can sit quietly in a hidden compartment or an old journal until the day someone finally shines a light on it. It's about truth having patience, about how secrets buried in the desert have a way of surfacing when the time is right, no matter how deeply someone tries to hide them under money, influence, or fear. It's about understanding that sometimes the people who spend years telling you you're not good enough are really just terrified that you might be better than them in every way that actually matters when the lights are off and no one's watching. They're not scared of your weaknesses. They're scared of your strength, your honesty, your refusal to cheat your way ahead. The men who maintain the lawns, who haul the equipment, who build with their hands, who fix the leaks, who pour concrete, who drive trucks through the night, the men and women who earn their calluses and wear their sweat like a quiet badge of honor, we're the backbone of this country, whether anybody at the country club wants to admit it or not. We're the ones who make sure the buildings they brag about actually stand, the lights in their offices stay on, the grounds they pose for photos on stay green in the middle of a desert. And sometimes, without even realizing it, we're also the ones who end up keeping America clean in ways nobody expects. Not just trimming hedges and mowing grass, but cutting away lies, exposing rot, dragging hidden things into the sunlight where they finally have to answer for what they are. My uncle did it wearing a uniform and carrying classified files. I did it wearing steel-toed boots and carrying his old journal. Different tools, same job, protect what's worth protecting. If you found value in this story, if something in it hit a little too close to home, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't measured by someone else's standards, or by the size of their paycheck, or by the price tag on their car. Maybe you've got a Gordon in your life, someone who constantly reminds you of what you're lacking, someone who keeps pointing up at higher shelves and telling you that what you have isn't enough. Maybe you've spent years feeling small at someone else's table, laughing along with jokes that cut a little too close just so you don't make things awkward. I've been there. I know what it's like to sit at the far end of the table, to feel like the help in your own life. So if this story made you feel seen, do me a favor. Drop a comment below about a time when someone underestimated you, wrote you off, or told you what you could never be. You don't have to share names or details that make you uncomfortable, but your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read on a rough night when they're sitting in a parked car wondering if they matter to anyone at all. Those moments when we feel the smallest are often the exact moments right before something big shifts. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, because that's the thing a lot of folks don't understand. Ordinary people are the ones holding this entire world together. The so-called important people like to stand on stages and give speeches, but it's regular people who keep the roads drivable, the shelves stocked, the kids cared for, the work actually done. Those are the stories I want to keep telling. Stories that remind you that courage doesn't always look like a movie scene. Sometimes it looks like getting up one more time after life knocks you flat, showing up to work when your heart feels broken, telling the truth when it would be easier to stay quiet. Maybe you're not dealing with spies and money laundering and decades-old conspiracies. Maybe your battle is a boss who doesn't respect you, a family member who never praises anything you do, or a voice in your own head that keeps replaying every mistake you've ever made. Maybe you feel like your life is stuck in a parking lot at 2 a.m., engine off, fuel low, no clear idea of where to go next. I want you to hear me clearly. That moment is not the end of your story. Sometimes it's the chapter right before the plot twist. Sometimes the thing that feels like your lowest point is exactly where the truth finally finds you. It might show up as a person, a phone call, a chance opportunity, or even just a realization that you can't keep living the way you've been living. When that moment comes, don't talk yourself out of it. Don't assume you're not worthy of a second chance or a new path. The people who benefit from your doubt will always be happy to keep you stuck in it. The people who truly care about you, who love your heart and your effort more than your job title, will be the ones cheering when you decide you deserve better. And if nobody around you is cheering, let me be the first. I'm proud of you for still being here, for listening, for trying, for not giving up even when the road feels endless. Here's another thing I learned the hard way. The money, status, and fancy addresses can hide a lot of darkness, but they can't erase it. Truth doesn't care how expensive your suit is. It doesn't care what club you belong to or how many zeros are in your account. Truth has its own timing. It waits. It watches. It lets people build their castles higher and higher, and then one day, sometimes thanks to a dusty box in a garage or a cop who decides to run one extra search, the foundation cracks and everything comes down. If you're on the side of truth, you might feel outnumbered for a while, but you are not outmatched. You might feel late, but you're not too late. My uncle didn't live to see justice, but his work still mattered. He planted something that took decades to fully grow. Your efforts might feel small now, but you have no idea what they might set in motion years from now for somebody else. So if you're out there working a job people look down on, or chasing a dream people call unrealistic, or holding on to your integrity when cutting corners would be easier, I want you to remember this story. Remember the landscaper they laughed at, the one they said should stay in his place, the one they thought would never matter beyond mowing lawns. Remember how the same hands that pushed a mower also protected evidence that brought down a network built on lies. Nobody saw it coming, least of all me. That's the funny thing about worth. It doesn't shout. It doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it just quietly refuses to disappear. So if you're listening to this driving home from a long shift, or sitting in a small apartment, wondering if your life is going anywhere, or taking a break in your work truck outside a job site, I want you to carry this with you. You are not less than anyone just because your success doesn't look like theirs. Your story is still being written, your effort still counts, your honesty still matters, and the people who judge you from a distance don't get to decide your ending. If this message resonated with you, hit like, share it forward, leave your story in the comments, and subscribe so we can keep building this little corner of the internet where working people, quiet people, honest people finally get to hear that they matter. Thank you for listening, for giving me your time, and remember your value doesn't decrease based on someone's inability to see your worth.